Good afternoon and welcome to Plenary 1. Please welcome Dr. Michael Boyle, President and CEO of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 37th North American Cystic Fibrosis Conference. It is great to be back together again with all of you here in Phoenix, and with so many people joining us virtually online. Welcome to those as well. I am so excited for this meeting. You know, we have nearly 5,000 people attending in person from 33 countries around the world and many, many more online. So on behalf of the CF Foundation, I want to share my deep gratitude to each one of you, researchers, clinicians, board members, volunteers, and especially people with CF and their families. You know, it's your extraordinary partnership and dedication which has enabled the remarkable progress that we continue to see as we write the CF story together. At the Foundation, we always talk about our work in three key areas, which we call the 3 C's. You've heard this before: cure, care, and community. And I think that you're going to find over these next few days in the 290 different sessions, yes, that is the exact number, I counted that on Monday, that we're going to dive in deep in each of these areas of cure, care, and community at this meeting, so that no matter what your interest, what your expertise is in CF, you're going to encounter new information, new ideas, and new people that will inspire you and are going to make us better as Team CF. As we get started today, I want to start by sharing a special thank you to our honorary co-chairs of this year's conference, and that's Dr. Margarita Amaral. We all know, an innovative CF researcher and a longtime CF science leader from Portugal, and Kristen Dunn, a member of the NACFC committee for the last 5 years, and the first person with CF to serve on the conference committee. So Margarita. So I just want to say thank you, Margarita and Kristen, not only for your contributions to this conference, but for your leadership and your hard work on behalf of people with CF for many years. Both of you certainly inspire us. You know, one thing that we can be absolutely confident about as we head into the next few days of meetings is that we have a lot of momentum in the progress that we're making together. I want to highlight a few specific examples of the momentum that have occurred since the last time we were together in Philadelphia. For starters, median predicted survival with CF in the US is now up to 56 years of age. That's right. So that's 18 years more than when we were together in Salt Lake City for NACFC 10 years ago. It doesn't seem that long ago that we were at Salt Lake City in those clean streets, right? And yet, during that time, added 18 years of life. So this is a number we fully expect to continue to grow. We're excited about that, but a real obvious sign of progress. We've also seen an ever-increasing number of adults with CF, now reaching nearly 60% of all people with CF being 18 years of age or older, another great sign of progress. How about some other things over this past year? So over the past year, we've seen progress in the expansion of highly effective CFTR modulators to many more people with CF, including now very young children, right, down to age 1 month for ivacaftor and 2 years for ETI. And in the last year, we've also generated extensive data, which has increased our understanding of the broad benefits of these therapies. Also in the past year, we've taken the next steps in transitioning our work in genetic therapies that treat everyone with CF, or can treat everyone with CF, no matter what mutations they have. And it's gone from being a theoretical, someday that we're going to get there, to an approach that's now here with us today, with early stage clinical trials, with multiple early trials in RNA and DNA replacement therapy, now ongoing or about to start. We've seen the start of trials with novel approaches to address difficult to treat infections and programs designed to address the ongoing challenges that people with CF continue to face, including GI issues and lung transplantation. We've seen highly effective CFTR modulators become available to more individuals with CF in the US and around the world than ever before. But we've also seen the importance of strong advocacy to policymakers to ensure continued access to these transformative medicines, as well as to drug makers to accelerate access for all people with CF around the world, because for people with CF, every day makes a difference no matter where they live. As we look ahead to these next few days of meetings, there's so much to be excited about. I want to give you 3 C's for this conference, 3 concepts that I think can guide us and help keep our momentum. So that first C is cutting-edge science. You know, innovative science is what has driven our progress. So let's be absolutely committed to the most rigorous and open discussion of science possible, starting with today's plenary. I've actually already seen it in the meetings we've been doing today, but that cutting-edge science. The second C is caring for people, right? So as we discuss best approaches to CF care and evolving the CF care model over the upcoming days, what we're really seeking to do is to care for and tailor our support for each person's with CF's own individual, unique journey, right? So as we discuss infection and mental health in plenary sessions 2 and 3, you're going to see this theme amplified. The last C is collaboration. Collaboration has been a hallmark of the CF community and of this meeting for decades. It makes us unique in the medical community, and it's one of the crucial qualities that have allowed us to achieve remarkable things. Let's continue that tradition of collaboration as Team CF at this meeting so we can continue to write the remarkable story of CF progress. It's now my honor to welcome the chair of the CF Foundation's Board of Trustees, Casey White. Casey has served on the CFF board for 18 years, took the role as board chair this past year. Casey was also the founding chair of the Adult Advisory Council for the foundation. She's the first person living with CF to serve as the chairman of our board, and we're thrilled to benefit from her leadership in this new era of CF. She reminds us every day the why behind what we do. So please join me in welcoming Casey.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome, everyone. It is truly an honor to be here in Phoenix with all of you this afternoon, and I'm excited about connecting with you and attending many of your sessions throughout the conference. I also want to send my warmest welcome to everyone joining online, especially those living with cystic fibrosis. Hello, my friends. Thank you for joining us for what I know will be a wonderful few days of time together, a time for learning, collaboration, and inspiration. As the chair of the CF Foundation's Board of Trustees and a person living with cystic fibrosis, it is my great privilege to speak to you today, and I hope to leave you with these 3 messages. You change lives, you are needed, and we are grateful. First, you change lives. The impact of your work is immeasurable. Over the years, you have transformed the lives of countless individuals with CF, including my own. Each day, the knowledge and dedication you bring to your field results in tangible improvements for people with CF. Here are just a few examples I have seen this year. Older people with CF achieving their highest lung function in decades. Women giving birth to babies they never thought they'd have. And my personal miracle is the great joy of celebrating both my 20th wedding anniversary with my husband and our son's 17th birthday. Indeed, you are changing lives. Second, you are needed. Even with the amazing progress that we have made, there is still work to be done. Just as I've seen stories of triumph, I've also seen stories of challenges. Little CF warriors enduring their first hospitalization, people waiting for life-saving transplants, others managing disabling GI symptoms, side effects from drugs, discouraging health decline. For me personally, I've been fighting a multi-drug resistant bacteria that's required my longest duration of IV antibiotics yet. Each CF challenge adds yet more pressure on our researchers and care teams. And we know that you too experience disappointments and setbacks. And that is why I want to emphasize that you matter. We need you. We rely on your expertise to keep pushing the boundaries and driving innovation. In new treatments today, and also in the field of genetic technologies, the science that will lead us to our cure. And finally, on behalf of the CF Foundation and all individuals with CF and their families, I want to express our deep gratitude for your dedication to our community. On the screen behind me, you will see images of individuals living with CF, some with their favorite care team member. They represent just a snapshot of the people whose lives you touch. Your tireless dedication to the well-being of those with CF offers us strength and hope, and we are so very grateful for the profound difference you make every single day. I know that working together, all of you will bring us more answers to the challenges we face and closer to a cure for all people with CF. Thank you so very much and have a wonderful conference.
Well, thank you, Casey. Thank you. I'm now pleased to turn the program over to Dr. Stephen Rowe, the Executive Vice President and Chief Scientific Officer of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, to get us started in our first plenary. You know, Steve oversees our basic science, academic research, and Path to a Cure programs, which include the Foundation's Therapeutics Lab and our biotech and pharmaceutical interactions. Steve has more than 2 decades of experience working in CF. He's a pioneer in personalized medicine and translational research for CF. He served as a principal investigator for the first triple combination therapy, Trikafta, which we know has transformed the lives of so many people in our community. Steve joined the CFF team this past year and comes to us from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where he cared for individuals with CF and served as a professor and director of the CF Research Center. He still has an appointment as a professor there. In a little over a year, he's built a fantastic research team, is leading a bold and ambitious research portfolio. Please join me in welcoming Steve.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you for being here and that thoughtful introduction. I've been a CF scientist for over 20 years, and I believe that now is one of the most pivotal and exciting times in CF research. The momentum you can feel here, which is exciting to be here, is making significant scientific advances and great strides towards innovative new therapies to people with CF. The Foundation is committed to ensuring this progress continues and accelerates. Last year alone, we spent $225 million on research, and we are planning for this pace to only increase as we strive to meet our goals. As you can see on the right side of this chart, we are focused on addressing the evolving and diverse needs of the community with a significant portion of our funding focused on the complications of CF. Many of you are already familiar with research into infection, gastrointestinal, and advanced lung disease, but we are also increasing our funding towards studies of emerging needs in the future. And that includes sexual and reproductive health, CF-related diabetes, and mental health, which you'll hear about in detail at Plenary 3. We are not only developing new and improved treatments, such as the next generation of CFTR modulators, but we are also seeking to improve how we use existing therapies to help people with CF live fulfilling lives. Continuing around the chart, the other large bucket is our genetic therapy work, which includes direct funding to biotech partners for the development of novel treatments, a robust research infrastructure to expedite this work, as well as basic research to discover new techniques that apply to CF and improve our understanding of concepts that underpin these innovative technologies. Our funding to develop genetic therapies and to lay the foundation for the development of a cure has increased by 230% since the initiation of the Path to a Cure initiative. All of this towards the goal of bringing highly impactful, but also treatments that are scientifically challenging to develop to individuals without therapies for their mutations. Our innovative approach to drug development and the robust ecosystem of support makes us uniquely positioned to accelerate commercial programs and give them the best opportunity for success and bringing these to people with CF. We currently have 28 major industry research programs alone focused on genetic therapies. And we're not just working on genetic therapies for some day in the future. As I stand here, there are several clinical trials already underway for RNA therapies and for gene delivery therapies in CF. We've made tremendous progress to advance treatments for the underlying cause of CF, with more than 90% of the US population with mutations that can benefit from existing CFTR modulators. But there's also still many people who are not eligible and cannot tolerate CFTR modulators. And we will not be satisfied until 100% of people with CF have access to transformative treatments to alter the course of disease. Noting this endeavor will also pave the way to the ultimate cure for everyone. And our most important work is still ahead. We are dedicated to helping assure the next wave of innovation will apply to individuals with the greatest need. Our priority is to develop highly effective therapies for people who currently do not have a treatment for the underlying cause of their disease. You heard many of the details during last year's plenary session, and the exciting work into therapies for nonsense and splice mutations continues, an area for which has been a major focus of mine since I began my research in CF. Among the other treatments I wanted to discuss include mRNA therapies, featured last year, and are indeed approaching a critical point as we are embarking in a number of crucial clinical trials in this area. We are leveraging scientific advancements in messenger RNA research and the exciting science in delivery molecules to develop mRNA therapies for CF. We remain bullish on these treatments as they have the potential to treat all people with CF, regardless of their mutation, and the science to optimize their delivery and expression continues to advance since our first studies in this arena just a few years ago, in addition to the collective global experience with mRNA vaccines. To test this important modality in people with CF, there are already 3 clinical trials in the CF Foundation pipeline already underway or will soon begin. The diversity of our mRNA portfolio with several different types of delivery approaches increases our opportunities for success, since we know this is the critical barrier. Turning to another technology, we anticipate the first clinical trial of a unique type of short RNA therapy for people with splice mutations, called antisense oligonucleotides, or ASOs, in CF to begin in the new year. Discussed in detail in last year's plenary, this technology leverages the remarkable success seen in therapies for spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA, that have been life-changing for children with that disease. Data jointly obtained by Splicence and academic collaborators, as well as the CF Foundation Therapeutics Lab, show substantial promise. You'll hear about updates in gene therapy research in more detail in today's scientific presentations. But gene addition is a process by which a new, correct version of the CFTR gene would be introduced into the cells in a person's body and expressed alongside the native gene. Although the mutant copies of the CFTR gene would still be there, the presence of the corrected CFTR gene copies will give cells the ability to make normal CFTR proteins. There's already a trial underway in the United States by 4D Molecular Therapeutics, which you'll hear about shortly, and other lentiviral trials are around the corner. In an effort to ensure that we leave no stone unturned, and to keep the consequential progress in this area, we are also supporting an extensive range of preclinical research into new genetic therapies as these technologies evolve. Just a few are shown on this slide. To bring the CF gene into the target cells, a challenge you will soon hear about in the plenary, the CF Foundation has become one of the preeminent sponsors to accelerate development of genetic delivery technologies. And we're doing this work more extensively in our laboratories, but also coupled hand in hand with academic collaborators around the world, attempting to recapitulate the success of these sorts of collaborations that have made CFTR modulators the transformative therapy that they have become. As these headlines point out, augmented by encouraging news you may have even heard about from the FDA reviews in the last several days, this is an incredible time in science. with tremendous progress being made to develop innovative therapies for genetic diseases. When a genetic cause of blindness can receive a treatment that allows recipients to read the newspaper, or those that can receive life-changing therapy for congenital adrenal leukodystrophy, a devastating genetic disease of childhood, you know we have entered a new era of medicine. And just this week, we have now clinical experience that CRISPR gene editing technologies can be effective in patients. As the technologies advance to become true therapies, they are also paving a path to the treatment of people with CF. I cannot wait to see the headlines talking about a new therapy for CF and how the commitment of those of you in this room help make this happen. And to talk about the details of these cutting-edge research that is already underway, it's an honor to introduce our next two speakers who are experts in the fields of gene therapy and gene editing to share their insights. First, Dr. Alexis Thompson, Chief of the Division of Hematology, and the Dr. Elias Schwartz Endowed Chair in Hematology at the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, and Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine. As our guest speaker, Dr. Thompson will discuss the development of gene therapies for sickle cell disease, including how the science has evolved, how they encountered new challenges and the ones they still face, and how engagement with the community has been a critical partner in the successful development of these therapies. We do not often ask speakers outside of a major focus of CF to speak at the plenaries, and do so today for an express purpose: to help communicate how the science fiction of the future that we have discussed here in past sessions, the ability to specifically bring in a potentially permanent cure for a genetic disease, is now becoming a reality. We work to learn from this experience, both from the scientific and drug development challenges, as well as the need to meaningfully engage the communities of color, who are often underrepresented in CF research trials, in a new way. She will be followed by Dr. Paul McCray, Professor and Chief Scientific Officer in the Department of Pediatrics and Division of Pulmonary Medicine at the Carver College of Medicine at the University of Iowa. A lifelong CF researcher, Dr. McCray will build on Dr. Thompson's talk to explain the unique challenges of developing genetic medicines for CF and how we might overcome these obstacles and recent advances that represent foundational progress as we enter the next period of clinical trials, while also the results of key studies, even recently, that show the potential to achieve this broadly applicable genetic cure. This session will pave the way for an improved understanding of how we develop novel and potentially curative gene therapies for all people with CF, regardless of their mutations, while learning from our new colleagues in sickle cell disease. Dr. Alexis Thompson, welcome to the stage.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. This is really a unique opportunity for me, and I truly appreciate the invitation to speak with you today, to share with you the sickle cell story, making the case for gene therapy. As I was listening, it was really so amazing that in several instances you could take out CF, put in SCD, and we're really trying to accomplish many of the same things, sometimes encountering some of the same challenges, but truly moving forward with the same hope. We're going to make this work, right? Yes, disclosures, must do those. When we talk about sickle cell disease, like cystic fibrosis, is a genetic mutation in a single gene. The beta globin gene encodes a major component of human hemoglobin, which is important for carrying oxygen. It's an autosomal recessive disorder that affects about 100,000 Americans, and so is considered a rare disease, but otherwise affects millions worldwide. Newborn screening, again, sound familiar in terms of CF, where available, has reduced morbidity and mortality. The single point mutation changes the characteristics of hemoglobin such that it polymerizes inside of red blood cells under certain conditions, in particular with deoxygenation, and as a consequence causes a severe hemolytic anemia with acute and potentially life-threatening exacerbations. There's also challenges with chronic ischemic organ injury and a shortened lifespan. This disease, again, like CF, often requires urgent attention and emergency care, and also ongoing chronic care management. It's a global condition. There are about 300,000 babies born each year with sickle cell across the globe, with the highest burden in sub-Saharan Africa, in Nigeria, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but also in India and across Southern Europe. Just like CF, for the longest time, this was a pediatric condition, and so for decades after this condition was first identified in the Western literature, it was uncommon to have anyone live beyond childhood. There were a number of investments, largely with federal funding for research, that saw that life expectancy increase starting in the mid-1970s. But it's also worth noting that while the life expectancy with sickle cell has improved, it is still only 45 years of age and lags behind the US population by almost 3 decades. It is a combination of acute and chronic complications. Sound familiar? Certainly the signature complication in sickle cell is excruciating pain that can occur suddenly and involve almost any part of the body, that often requires hospitalizations for high doses of opioids. But other complications, both acute and chronic, cause tremendous disability and shortening of life. A single agent, hydroxyurea, has been studied for nearly 40 years in sickle cell disease and was FDA approved for adults in 1997. And that is sort of a box on this arrow. Fast forward all the way across to 2017. There were no new drugs developed in that entire time period for sickle cell disease. And so if you can imagine a disease as complicated as CF or sickle cell disease with so few tools in your toolkit, how can one possibly imagine making progress? Yet we have. Newborn screening allowed us to be able to keep children healthy and safe for as long as possible. And over time, we've convinced ourselves that we can not only provide hydroxyurea across all ages, but we really can across a much wider group of people, so that some of the asterisks, for instance, are more recent clinical trials in low and middle income countries, where we now can also say that that hydroxyurea will have some of the same benefits. There certainly have been other medications that have been added, and so 3 additional agents have been approved by the FDA in the last 3 to 4 years, with slightly different indications, different ways of being delivered, with some differences in side effects. And some of them can be given safely in combination, but still far less than what we really need to make a difference in this disease. Fortunately, there are approximately 30 agents that are with active sickle cell related indications that are in the clinical development pipeline. Now, it's certainly highly unlikely that all of these will make it to the point where they will actually make it through the entire process and be available to help people, but it certainly is encouragement about new investments that are being made to move us forward in sickle cell disease. So we've talked about drug treatment. Allogeneic stem cell transplant is now the only current curative option for sickle cell disease. It has its risks and it has its limitations, which we'll talk briefly about. But I'm going to be talking to you quite a bit about ex vivo gene therapy, something that we're particularly excited about. This has been a remarkable week in the sickle cell world, with the FDA having an advisory committee meeting to discuss the possibilities of approving a CRISPR-based gene therapy. In vivo gene therapy, we hope at some point will also be something that we can offer families, but that today is not today. It's well into the future. When I think about how transformative a gene therapy could be, I can't think of really a number of things that we can talk about, but I really want you to hear from an expert in that space. But when I think about allogeneic stem cell transplants, I think it's important, sadly, to recognize that only 1 in 5 individuals will actually have a sibling donor. And so that really puts it out of reach. And while we have Be the Match, the National Marrow Donor Program, there are still often unrelated donors available, especially for children of color. There are open research studies for unrelated donors and reduced intensity transplants, and now even haploidentical, where other family members that are partially matched can be used. But the complication list is quite long, not least of which is marrow failure, but serious and sometimes life-threatening infections, graft versus host disease, infertility, and the risk of transplant-related mortality, which certainly has made it very difficult to think about this being a universal treatment in sickle cell disease. When I think about, though, gene therapy, I'd like you to hear from an expert in that space.
I'm Victoria. I'm a sickle cell patient who received the gene editing therapy. I'm also a mom of 4. My oldest is Asia, my oldest son is Jamarius, and I have twins, Jaden and Jadasia. Sickle cell disease is an inherited blood disorder that causes the red blood cells to be misshapen, which causes them to get stuck in the blood vessels and cause blockages, which also causes pain and lack of oxygen. I would have pain in my arms, in my legs, my back, all over my body. The pain felt like lightning strikes, and sometimes it felt like I was being hit by a truck. And the only treatments was just more pain medicines, IV fluids, and blood transfusions in hopes that I would just overcome it after time. I really wanted to become a nurse, and I couldn't, so because I had to miss so many days out of college, I just stopped dreaming of becoming a nurse. By the time I was 30, I would be in the hospital at least once a month. And those hospital stays were very long, 2 weeks, a month at a time. And it seemed like once I would get out, I was only returning back to the hospital again. It really affected my children. Like, my daughter would call me and say, "Mom, I was crying last night." And I said, "Why were you crying?" She said, "Because they took you away in the ambulance and I was scared." I have 2 sons, and their behavior started to change in school, where they would act out and get in a lot of trouble, and the grades changed. So my oldest son's teacher, she called me in for a meeting, and she said, "Victoria, I'm going to be honest with you. Jamarius is acting out because he thinks you're going to die." And that was heartbreaking, that my kids had the fear of losing me. And what was worse, like, I felt that I was gonna die too. And I didn't want to be without them, so I was willing to do anything. Gene editing has really changed my life. I no longer have hospital stays. I no longer have ER visits. I no longer get blood transfusions. And I no longer have pain. I look forward to my future. I work full-time. I get to participate in my children's activities. They get to live normal lives as teenagers with normal worries as far as what outfit are they gonna wear and who they're gonna take to prom. I think gene editing can not only help people with sickle cell disease, but people born with all type of genetic disorders. Getting this and seeing the turnaround gives me hope for my family and for others who are suffering, who feel like that's just the end, you know, that they have to die with what they were born with or what they developed later in life. But now there's hope that treatments are out there and we are advancing. So don't give up, hold on, help is coming.
An absolutely remarkable story about what is possible. Let's tell you a little bit more about gene therapy for sickle cell disease. Today, it's ex vivo. And so a sickle cell patient, once having taken through the informed consent and the screening process, has their stem cells isolated. Those stem cells are then sent to a laboratory where they are modified some way and then frozen. The patient then undergoes conditioning with chemotherapy, and then their cells are reinfused. But fundamentally, the advancement of gene therapy for sickle cell is because the patient serves as their own donor. Ex vivo manipulation is currently what we're able to do, and it's in a number of forms. Gene addition that Dr. Rowe just talked about, gene editing, and soon base editing. It does require ablative chemotherapy, and it's for 2 reasons in sickle cell disease. The first is actually literally to physically make space in the bone marrow to receive these modified stem cells. The second is to reduce the absolute load of cells that are unmodified, because there is no survival advantage of these new modified cells, and they could certainly be crowded out of the marrow space if we did not reduce the number of their existing, albeit abnormal, stem cells. Dr. Rao's already talked about a couple of these, and they certainly are the same considerations in sickle cell, that gene correction could replace the sequences at the site of the native gene. Gene addition could introduce copies of a normal gene, but leaving the defective native gene intact. We also have learned enough about sickle cell that there are other genes that are important for the overall expression of this disease. And so modifying the expression of one of these other genes that play a role in the disease phenotype or pathogenesis might be a path forward for genomic therapies. And then finally, genome editing, being able to directly repair specific sequences. In sickle cell and a related condition, thalassemia, which is a disease caused by mutations in the same gene, adding a normal beta globin gene using gene addition could convert someone with sickle cell to looking like sickle cell trait, as if they were a carrier. And we know that carriers, by and large, are asymptomatic and will live normal lifespans. In thalassemia, a transfusion-dependent state, we want to reduce and potentially eliminate transfusion dependence. If we could increase fetal hemoglobin, that kind of hemoglobin that babies make prior to birth and make for the first 6 months of life, either by gene editing or gene addition, this also might be therapeutic in sickle cell. We can do that by adding gamma globin, which is the subunit that makes fetal globin and is non-sickling. We could also modify beta globin to make it more gamma-like, less prone to sickling. Or again, alter the expression of a gene that could regulate fetal globin. There clearly is interest in gene therapy, not only in hematology, but across the entire commercial landscape. And this is meant to depict all of the different aspects of medicine where there's active work being done to consider an application for gene therapy. In the outer core, looking at preclinical, so most of the activity is still in the preclinical space. But as you go closer and closer to the middle of that bullseye, we become closer and closer to the possibility of actually having commercially available or marketed therapy. And I'm very pleased to be in hematology right now and to see that we've already moved into that bullseye. There are a number of clinical trials in sickle cell and thalassemia that are being done globally, many of them in the United States and Europe, and I'll share with you a few of the highlights of ones that are now being resulted. Lentiglobin BB305 is the one that we understand the most about. And this is a lentiviral vector that has been highly modified so that it is replication defective and self-inactivating, but contains the coding sequence for the human beta globin gene with one important modification, and that is a modification that's called T87Q, which is an amino acid substitution. Ironically, it's actually the sequences that are actually seen in fetal globin or in gamma globin that inhibit sickling. And so certainly it may inherently be beta globin, but beta globin hopefully with an improvement. This particular vector also has the beta locus control region, which are the regulatory sequences that exist in our human genome that make this erythroid specific. So it is only expressed in red cell precursors. And it's that combination that allows us to drive expression of beta globin in this program. Another key feature of this is that it allows us to use high-performance liquid chromatography to monitor the transgene. And this is depicted here. So even though I can often think about there being normal beta A, which a patient with sickle cell won't make, but I can get from the blood bank, I can distinguish between blood bank hemoglobin A from gene therapy, separate from beta S, which is their defective kind of hemoglobin, in a peripheral blood test. And so it certainly has given us a unique view. This is how the gene therapy works. Patients have their stem cells collected and they are sent to a laboratory. In the laboratory, their most primitive stem cells, or CD34 cells, are selected, and they are transduced with the BB305 vector containing the beta globin sequences. Once that is completed, they are cryopreserved and they undergo a number of safety tests. During this time, the patient is home and doing well. The patient is then recalled, and they undergo myeloablative chemotherapy over 4 days with busulfan, a few days of rest, and then their drug product is reinfused. They remain hospitalized until we see early activity of their transduced hematopoietic stem cells, which will hopefully contribute to the production of functional red blood cells that have now been transformed because they now can incorporate T87Q beta globin into normal hemoglobin. The clinical trials have gone for 2 years, during which the patients are followed periodically as outpatients, and in agreement with the FDA, they've agreed to continue with long-term follow-up for a total of 15 years. This was the first child that was done in the world in Paris, and that was reported in 2017. This is a child who had a stroke and was being transfused to prevent future strokes. Once that child was given gene therapy, we stopped transfusing that child, and so their transfused hemoglobin A decreased. But over a relatively short period of time, a matter of months, we saw the emergence of hemoglobin A with a T87Q marker. And by 1 year, that amount of T87Q was in balance with their native gene's production of hemoglobin S, but now with a normal hemoglobin completely unsupported by transfusions and no symptoms of sickle cell disease. This led to the clinical trials beginning in the United States, and I had the privilege of being part of those early trials, where we used bone marrow, which at the time was the primary way to obtain hematopoietic stem cells. Those cells were harvested and then sent to the laboratory, but we learned a number of things. One, that the bone marrow of patients with sickle cell was highly damaged because the marrow space was inflamed and hypoxic. This led to very low yields of hematopoietic stem cells when they arrived in the laboratory, which meant that the efficiency of transduction was poor. We also gave them conventional doses of busulfan, but our ability to myeloablate was insufficient. And so in the first group of patients in gene therapy, we saw suboptimal engraftment of transduced cells. Fast forward, we've learned a great deal. Changes in this protocol have now set the standard for gene therapy for sickle cell disease and other related conditions. Patients now have transfusions to hopefully make them healthier going into gene therapy. We use plerixafor to mobilize their stem cells into circulation and collect their cells by apheresis. We have changed the purification process and have improved the transduction procedure. We also have focused on making sure that we are optimizing the busulfan dose by looking at pharmacokinetics and focusing on the area under the curve to see successful engraftment. And that's shown on this slide. Each one of these lines in blue represents an individual patient, and each diamond and hospitalization usually for a vaso-occlusive pain episode in the 2 years prior to gene therapy. In gold are those same patients and the time period following gene therapy, and there's a complete resolution of severe vaso-occlusive episodes in these individuals. We also noted an improvement in their patient-reported outcomes, so whether it is pain, depression, anxiety, physical function, whether they were people whose disabilities far exceeded normative population, or for those who felt that they were doing reasonably well, all had clinical benefit in their patient-reported outcomes after gene therapy. So what I've described for you is the ability to look at sickle cell disease and then following gene therapy, whether it's by adding T87Q or otherwise, to have the patients create an anti-sickling hemoglobin. And this was using a lentiviral vector. But in the case of Victoria, she had gene editing, and in that case, we relied upon CRISPR-Cas9, but there certainly are other nuclease platforms that can be used that create double-stranded DNA breaks, so a break across each one of the DNA strands. A correction is made, and then the normal repair processes creates an indel, which is, if you could imagine, is a scar, but a good kind of scar because it has fundamentally changed the function of an important gene. That approach has been undertaken by Vertex in the CTX001 study, which is using CRISPR-Cas9 to target a gene called BCL11A. This is an example of a gene whose modification can be beneficial in sickle cell disease because it allows the body to actually go back to making that hemoglobin that infants and fetuses benefited from. So by silencing BCL11A, you can get reactivation of gamma globin so that the body can begin making hemoglobin F again. And they're using this, targeting it, using CRISPR-Cas9, which my colleague, Dr. McCray, will talk more about in the context of cystic fibrosis. And these are their early results. So until Tuesday's hearing before the FDA, this was the most robust public information, but each one of these lanes, again, is an individual patient and the time after gene therapy that they remain pain-free. The numbers are higher now, but the results are nearly identical in that there's a 97% of patients are pain-free following gene editing with CTX001. Both of the programs that I've just shared with you are being reviewed by the FDA as we speak, and the hope is there will be 2 announcements made in the month of December about approval, ideally, of both agents. So we've talked a lot about gene editing, which I often depict as a scissors, and these different kinds of nuclease editing we're thrilled to see and are very hopeful about their applications in other genetic diseases. But base editing is an even newer approach that does not involve opening the double helix. It does not require a break across both strands. It is a single nucleotide substitution, and so allows us to do a direct conversion of a single base pair without a double-stranded break. And this is being considered by BEAM in BEAM 101, which is a trial that is currently enrolling, to recreate something called the hereditary persistence of fetal hemoglobin by using a base editor, in this case an adenine base editor, to change or to edit the regulatory sequences upstream of gamma globulin that will actually allow the patients to resume making high levels of fetal hemoglobin, which hopefully will be therapeutic in the same way the CRISPR-Cas approach has been. There still are remaining questions and very important ones to consider. Outcomes, risk, and access. There are a number of factors to consider in terms of that will affect the outcomes for gene therapy. And again, I think some of these will be highly relevant to cystic fibrosis. The severity of the disease itself coming into transplant is going to be one of the most important criteria to look at positive outcomes in terms of organ health. And so to the extent that we have avoided permanent injuries to organs coming into transplant, we are more likely to see better outcomes. In the case of sickle cell, one of the therapies is given are blood transfusions, which often leave behind considerable amounts of iron, which is detrimental and damaging to a number of organs. So your iron status in diseases like sickle cell and thalassemia will impact the outcomes for gene therapy. The degree of marrow ablation, as I've already shared with you, is critically important, as is the number of cells that we give back to the individual. We need to have high numbers of stem cells that actually have the correction or the modification in order for this to work. And that correction needs to be pancellular. If it is only correction in a very small number of their cells, the native cells will outcompete these modified cells. And then finally, another question is about age. Many of us can imagine, of course, as a pediatrician, perhaps it's my own bias, that children will do better, in part because they have not had many of the organ injury that sometimes is permanent in adults, and certainly children in the hematopoietic stem cell or the allotransplant experience have done better. Having said that, the FDA approved gene therapy for thalassemia in 2022. And in that setting, when we looked at the very youngest patients that were done, down to age 4, and the oldest patients done up to their late 30s, there were no differences, that all had the same degree of benefit, that there were no new toxicities for children who were much younger, or for that matter, for adults who were older. And so certainly while in the past, for standard transplants, there might have been a difference. Not quite clear yet whether or not gene therapy will have unique challenges based on age. The risks of gene therapy are significant, and many of them are related to busulfan chemotherapy. Conditioning is associated with painful mouth sores, temporary hair loss, and some significant liver problems that can be life-threatening. There's also a risk of graft failure, and so all patients have an aliquot of their own stem cells on reserve that are unmodified. Delayed platelet engraftment does come with a risk of bleeding, but fortunately today there have been no such complications. Clonal dominance or insertional oncogenesis can be precursors to cancers. And so this is one of many reasons for ongoing monitoring for that total of 15 years for lentiglobin programs. For gene editing programs, off-target gene editing was the primary topic of discussion by the FDA advisory panel and will continue to be the focus of ongoing questions. Infertility is a problem in sickle cell, although not a major one. And in gene therapy today, the primary contributor to infertility is the chemotherapy. We think the standard of care must be that all individuals undergoing gene therapy must be given the opportunity to have fertility preservation. And that has certainly been built into all of the clinical trials that have been run thus far. And we'll be making strong arguments in the approval space to be sure that people do not have to choose between being parents and perhaps obtaining a cure. Access and equity, I think, are things that I believe will resonate with this audience as they have in sickle cell. Once new therapies are approved for use, will they be out of reach for some or for many? I think this is something that we all need to grapple with now. In no way do we want to disenfranchise people just as we are on the brink of having something that is so absolutely wonderful. And so we certainly are striving to examine what those barriers might be and to look for the opportunities to overcome them. This is particularly important in sickle cell disease, where we expect the global burden of sickle cell to rise by 30% if we do not intervene by 2050. And we know that in certain areas of the globe, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, 90% of those children will not survive to adulthood. And in fact, over 50% of them will not see their 5th birthday. Clearly, we can do better. 1,000 children are born every day with sickle cell disease. There are only 1,200 in the United States in a year. So clearly there is some urgency in us considering what can be done for those children now. They're still far behind us. We're advocating for newborn screening in Africa, which we believe has been life-saving in places like the United States and high-resource countries. Yet many people in Africa look forward to a cure as well. There are remaining questions. Will this single infusion be durable? Are there additional modifications to reduce risk? I certainly hope so. Will results be better in younger patients? Will genome editing, or for that matter, base editing, achieve similar or superior results to lentiglobin gene addition or to allotransplants? And then what, after all, will constitute a cure? So in summary, we've made progress in sickle cell, much in the way you have with cystic fibrosis, in ways that have extended the lifespan for many. But disease and treatment-related complications result in significant morbidity. The early results of gene therapy and gene editing in sickle cell have been amazingly promising. For patients with sickle cell, seeing a reduction in pain that is similar to that achieved with allogeneic transplant has been extraordinary. There are opportunities to improve access, and I believe that we all need to work together to overcome those so that we can improve outcomes for more patients. And with that, I thank you. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. McCray, to share with you the CF story in gene editing, in gene therapy. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Dr. Rowe and the organizers for the opportunity to speak to you today about genetic therapies for cystic fibrosis. This has been a topic I've been interested in since the early 1990s, after the CFTR gene was discovered and correction of the ion transport defect was demonstrated by 2 laboratories using gene addition approaches in CF cells within a year after the gene was found. Today, we live in a renaissance time for genetic therapies, with significant advances in several technologies and impressive results from clinical trials for other genetic diseases, as we have just learned from the elegant presentation by Dr. Thompson. So today I'll tell you about how advances in genetic therapies are being applied to cystic fibrosis. So let's get started. This is my disclosure. So our overarching goal is to restore CFTR function in the airways of all people with CF, and this includes those ineligible or unresponsive to modulators. Dr. Rowe put a version of this slide up earlier. Recall that 6% of people with CF do not have therapies that restore CFTR function, and in yellow are those folks with nonsense mutations such as G542X, R553X, and W1282X. Importantly, all people with CF can benefit from gene addition or gene editing therapies. Let's review our definitions here. So, genetic therapies will deliver copies of the healthy CFTR gene using a gene addition approach, such as delivering DNA or RNA, or try to fix the chromosomal DNA using gene editing approaches. Let's review how a protein is made. So recall that DNA with the genetic code of AT and GC base pairs has the information to make the protein. This is transcribed to messenger RNA, translated into a polypeptide into a mature protein, in the example here of the CFTR protein. And so this basic strategy underlies the genetic therapies we'll discuss. Now, unlike sickle cell disease, for cystic fibrosis today, we do not have an approach that involves taking the cells out of the body, fixing them, and putting them back in. Although people are interested in this and working on this, we also do not have a way to deliver genes to all the genetic therapies to all the organs affected by cystic fibrosis. So currently our focus is on lung disease, where we know we have big problems to fix. And our approaches currently, rather than a systemic delivery, involve a topical delivery via aerosol, for example. There are also some unique challenges to delivery of genetic therapies to the airways, including the anatomy, developing effective delivery methods, and targeting key CFTR expressing cells. Let's talk a little bit about regional airway anatomy, something near and dear to me. So there are 23 generations approximately of airways that progressively branch like the branches of a tree or the roots of a tree, becoming progressively smaller. And on the right side there, I have some examples of what the cells look like lining these tissues. These epithelial cells lining the organ are our targets with genetic therapies. So, for example, ciliated and secretory cells lining these airways could be targets. And in red are some of the stem cells that we know about, basal cells and club cells in the small airways. But you can see just how the basic architecture makes delivery something that we have to really master. Also, the cell types along the airways can vary by region. So for example, submucosal glands are present in the large cartilaginous airways, but not in the small airways. Ciliated and secretory cells are distributed across the large and small airways. The progenitor cells can differ depending upon the compartment. Basal cells are present throughout the large and small airways, whereas the club cell stem cell is a small airway cell type. So the secretory cells are the most abundant CFTR expressing cell type. So they're a target for genetic therapies. Also, stem cells, if they could be permanently corrected, are the source of making all of the surface cell types. So they're important targets also. That's why we talk about the basal cell a lot. So let's talk a little bit more about the cell types that are our targets. Here's a cartoon of the surface airway epithelium. So there are surface cell types that are differentiated, and we know these slowly turn over time, and in certain disease states they might turn over faster. One example is a secretory cell type. Those are indicated by the arrow there. And multiciliated cells are another surface cell type that we know turns over. And then there are rare cell types that we've been learning about through single-cell RNA sequencing, such as the ionocyte. This is a cell that has a lot of CFTR in it, but it's a very rare cell. In contrast, there are stem cells in the airway, and the basal cell is one I just mentioned, shown here in red, and the club cells are in the small airways. So depending upon which cell type receives a genetic therapy, it may last shorter or longer. So the differentiated cell types, if they're the only cells targeted, they're going to gradually turn over, and then the therapy will need to be repeated. But if we can target a stem cell compartment and permanently modify it, it will make all the new surface cell types and could be a lasting or permanent cure. How are we going to deliver all of these things? We have multiple delivery vector options, and here are some of them listed. On the left, we have viral vectors. One you've probably heard about is adeno-associated virus. It's a member of the parvovirus family. It's often just called AAV, and it's a DNA vector. One of its relatives is bocavirus. It can carry slightly larger genetic cargoes. Dr. Thompson just told us about lentiglobin and the lentivirus vector. Lentiviruses are RNA viruses that convert their genome to DNA and then can insert it into the host cell chromosome. So we call that an integrating vector, and it can be permanently resident and making its gene products. So if this happened in a stem cell, then we could have permanent correction. Bacteriophages are also under investigation, and there are a number of non-viral vectors, such as the lipid nanoparticles that Dr. Rowe mentioned for mRNA therapy, polymeric nanoparticles. These can carry DNA, RNA, protein cargoes. Another delivery approach is a peptide. Amphiphilic peptides can deliver protein cargoes into cells. And virus-like particles have the outside of a virus to help target cell types, but no viral genes, and can carry a variety of cargoes. And there are other approaches not mentioned here. The good news is we have lots of options, and this is good to have. I'm going to specifically give some examples related to AAV and lentivirus vectors, and also the peptide delivery approach. Importantly, each vector has certain advantages. It may have ability to carry larger or smaller cargoes. For example, AAV vectors can carry about the size of the CFTR gene, but not more. But other vectors have larger carrying capacities. And I mentioned that some vectors will integrate into the host cell, like a lentivirus, or perhaps with gene editing tools, we're permanently modifying the genome. But vectors like AAV, for example, if it's delivering a DNA cargo, an expression cassette for CFTR, it'll persist as long as the life of the cell it enters, but then it'll be gone because it's not integrating. Different vector systems have different abilities to target particular cell types, and also to navigate mucus and immune barriers. So overall, our focus now is on delivery to the airways. So I've outlined some of the technical challenges we are facing with the path to a cure therapies, and we know we want to address the needs for all people with CF, including those unresponsive to modulator therapies. Now I want to share with you the real-life experience of a person with 2 copies of the G542X mutation.
So my CF story is really interesting. My parents actually met in Bogota, Colombia. and that's where I was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. My parents were able to get married, and my dad brought us over to the United States because he felt that there were more options medically. My mom was hoping that there would be some sort of cure here, and as we all know, there was no cure. I had a very good childhood. I was able to visit my family in Colombia every year since I was 6. I was able to travel. I was able to study abroad in Europe. Really, my life started to change and my health started to change when I was around 24. That was the first time that I had gotten pneumonia. Ever since then, it kind of became a snowball effect into more common and frequent CF exacerbations. Even just the past 2 years, I've been hospitalized 6 times. Living with my parents is definitely not a decision that I could make. It was just a life choice that had to happen. Realistically, my mother is my caregiver. So as much as I would love to have independence, I really do need her. Trying to eat 3 times a day is much harder than one would even think, as well as taking a shower. That's exhausting, and I have to try to keep motivated every single day to try to at least get out of bed, at least walk the dog if I can, and do all these things that everybody else kind of just goes through and takes for granted, and it's very difficult. It's even harder for me because of my nonsense mutations. I am a very microscopic percentage of an already microscopic percentage of a population, and I don't feel that I can relate to anybody. And at this point, it feels like I can't even relate to my community because everybody is light years ahead of me now since being on Trikafta. So it is a very lonely feeling. What excites me about genetic therapies is getting back to my daily routines without struggling and without pain is the biggest thing that I could think of. Getting out of the house more, being able to travel more, seeing my friends and family more. For me, it's always been, well, what's the point of being alive or being present here for so long if you're miserable or if you're in pain? And that to me just isn't a life that's fair or really worth living. And I know what life was like before this, so I really would hope that I could get back to that. The story behind my classic car is one of my favorites. It has always been my dream car since high school, actually. I've always been that child that's very active and imaginative. When I'm in this car, it really just feels like I can step away from the harsh realities of what I feel and what I go through every single day. I feel more able-bodied, so to speak, when I'm in the car because you can't see me doing treatment, you can't see me struggling. I don't show any of that. It's just me and the car. It really is such a sense of pride for me that I got and I achieved something that I really wanted in this lifetime.
Such a real powerful and motivating message from Gina Ruiz. Next, I'd like to give some examples of genetic therapies in development, first focusing on gene addition strategies. So I'm going to talk about some work with lentivirus vectors that we've been doing at the University of Iowa, and this recent work spearheaded by Ashley Cooney and Patrick Sin. So we can apply lentivirus vectors directly to the surface of primary human airway cells in culture, as shown in this diagram. And we can do this with lentivirus that encode a green fluorescent protein or the CFTR gene. And then we can look at outcomes like the efficiency of gene transfer, the cell types we can transduce, and whether we can rescue CFTR function. So importantly, this is a mutation agnostic approach relevant to any CFTR mutation class. It's an autosomal recessive disease. If you put a normal copy of the gene back in, you should be able to restore function. So if we take cells and look directly down on them with no lentivirus, we don't see any green fluorescent protein. But if we apply the vector, we see many cells expressing the green fluorescent protein. And this includes the surface cells I described and the basal stem cells. So we can do the same approach with a CFTR vector and human CF airway epithelia. And we can look for CFTR function by measuring the chloride conductance across the epithelium. So in this graph, the y-axis is the short circuit current, and then the x-axis is time. And so if we apply a CFTR channel opener to cells that have received no treatment, we see no response. And similarly, when we apply the CFTR channel blocker, we see no effect. This is what non-CF cells look like in the same setting. You see a brisk increase in the current with the CFTR channel opener, and then it's inhibited by the channel blocker. After we apply the CFTR vector to CF cells, we similarly can see a CFTR current. So using this approach, we can see correction that persists over time. We followed cells in culture for over a year. We can restore CFTR function in the airways of a CF pig model using a lentivirus vector, and we've done studies in mice that show that we can repeatedly administer the vector to animals without inducing blocking immune responses. I'd like to give some examples of gene addition approaches now approaching or in clinical trials. So the first one is a collaboration between Boehringer Ingelheim and the UK CF Gene Therapy Consortium. They're planning a lentivirus gene addition clinical trial. Here I have an example of some of their preclinical work in a non-human primate where they delivered a lentivirus expressing GFP, here showing up as red because they use an antibody to detect it. On the left, you see an airway where no lentivirus was applied, and you don't see any red. On the right, after lentivirus addition, you see diffuse expression of the gene product in the surface cells. And in their preclinical studies, they've shown this transduction in several animal models, in human airway tissues ex vivo, and shown that this will last for the life of a mouse. They also have been able to repeat this in mice. And importantly, as we heard from Dr. Thompson, safety is a big concern with lentivirus vectors because they are integrating. And in their preclinical studies, they've seen no acute toxicity or evidence of insertional oncogenesis. But this needs to be studied over time. They've also developed scalable manufacturing approaches to make the vector for the trial. So briefly, the trial is going to be a nebulized lung delivery approach for people unresponsive to CFTR modulators. And they will have clinical endpoints such as FEV1 and molecular surrogates to look for CFTR function. They're planning a phase 1 dose escalation study followed by a phase 2 dose expansion. And this trial is targeted to start in mid-2024 pending regulatory approval. And like Dr. Thompson mentioned, this would include long-term follow-up for 15 years. So 4D Molecular Therapies has an ongoing gene addition trial using an AAV vector. And there's a schematic of the trial along the bottom there. So this trial started in March of 2022. And I'm going to talk about the first 7 patients. And these patients received nebulized AAV vector. And there are two cohorts, number 1 and 2. One received a lower dose than cohort 2. 1 month after the nebulized delivery, subjects underwent a bronchoscopy to obtain airway biopsies to look for evidence of the vector function. And also at multiple time points along the year of the study, clinical measurements were made, including lung function. So remember, AAV is a DNA vector, so to look for its RNA product, they performed a technique called in situ hybridization on the airway biopsies. On the top right is a sample from a CF lung with no treatment, and you see no signal there. The bottom two pictures show airway biopsies from the two cohorts, and there's a brown signal for the RNA that can be detected. It's denoted by those arrows. The graph on the bottom left shows the percentage of the epithelial cells where they detected this signal, and they saw signal in all biopsies from the 7 subjects studied so far. They've also looked at lung function over time, and this is data from the first 3 participants in cohort 1. So participants 1 and 3 had good baseline lung function that remained stable over the 12-month follow-up. And participant 2 is shown in the graph on the bottom with the percent predicted FEV1 on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And this participant's lung function remained stable over time and is slightly higher at the end of a 12-month follow-up. So these are all encouraging first results in an ongoing safety trial. And you can hear more about this in a symposium. Gene editing tools, turn genes on, turn genes off, fix genes, insert genes. All of these things are being investigated. We don't have a strategy with cystic fibrosis to turn something off, but otherwise these strategies apply. I'd like to talk about adenine base editing. This was introduced by Dr. Thompson. We and others have had an interest in applying this towards cystic fibrosis. Adenine base editing involves using a catalytically inactive CRISPR molecule that's tethered to an adenosine deaminase enzyme. This can convert an AT pair to a GC pair. And about 50% of all CFTR point mutations are potentially amenable to adenine base editing. And we and others have looked at the R553X mutation as a trial run for this. And I'm going to give an example of what we've been doing. So we've been interested in delivering the base editor in the form of a protein because it will be very transiently active and then go away. And to deliver this, we've used an amphiphilic peptide in collaboration with Felden Therapeutics. And in the diagram below, I have the DNA where the point mutation occurs. So you see that A residue, which results in a stop codon in the sequence there. Now, if a base editor does its job, it'll convert that A T pair to a GC pair, and now the arginine codon is restored. So to test this, we've taken the base editor protein, a base editor called ABE8E, in the form of the protein, and applied it to the surface of cells with the R553X mutation with the peptide shuttle. And we've looked at restoration of CFTR function in the assay I just described. So with no treatment, we see no CFTR function. Here's our positive control with non-CF cells. And then following base editor editing of the CF R553X mutation, we now see restoration of CFTR current. And when we do sequencing of these cells, we see editing in up to 9% of the epithelia. So we've also extended this into the airways of animals, administering the base editor and the peptide by aerosol in non-human primates and pigs. And when we do bronchial brushings in the regions described in that diagram on the left and do sequencing, we've seen editing of 5 to 11% of airway epithelial cells with a single administration. So this is encouraging in vivo data that it's possible to edit those epithelial cells. Now I'd like to shift gears and talk about large gene insertion technologies. Here the goal is to try to fix many mutations by a single approach. In a way, this is analogous to gene addition, putting the normal copy here. I'll talk a little bit about an alternative strategy using large gene insertion. This is sort of a holy grail where we could fix basically the majority of mutations in using one approach. And one approach is called a super-exon insertion. So on the bottom is a diagram of the CFTR gene. The exons are shown in gray. These are the protein coding portions, and the intervening sequences are the introns. When the gene is mutated, these can be scattered across the exons, as shown by these vertical red lines. So the super-exon would be a DNA sequence encoding exons 2 through 7, and then flanked by a splice acceptor site on the left-hand side and a stop codon and polyadenylation signal on the right-hand side. The goal would be to insert this into intron 1 without making a double-strand break, and thereby harness the normal regulatory elements of the CFTR gene and restore CFTR function. Now, this will require particular challenges in terms of how to deliver this material and how to optimize such an approach. And it sounds kind of like science fiction, but advances are being made. And I'd like to give one example of this approach. And this is from a group of researchers at Saliogen, a company working on this problem. So they're engineering and they're using engineered and targeted versions of a mammalian transposon to move DNA into a specific location in the genome. So as diagrammed here, when the hypersaliagase enzyme is delivered to cells along with the donor DNA encoding the super-exon, this will travel through the cytoplasm to the nucleus and then find its target site in the first intron of the CFTR gene, and then the enzyme will catalyze the insertion of the super-exon. And they have early evidence of success doing this in cell models, but there's still more work to do to advance this to a therapy. And as I outlined earlier, there are multiple delivery options. So that's also in the game. And also other groups, academic and biotech, are working on this and related approaches. And you can learn more about these at the symposium workshops mentioned there below. In addition, there are a number of other presentations that will happen at the meeting in symposia talks, workshops, and many posters, as outlined here. So in conclusion, I hope you're learning today that there are treatment advances in other diseases that show the promise of genetic therapies as cures. And many genetic therapy approaches are under investigation for cystic fibrosis today. And from these, we are going to learn about which ones work the best and what delivery methods are most applicable to our goal. In addition, ongoing and future clinical trials will help inform development. So there's really great momentum now for advancing genetic therapies for cystic fibrosis. In closing, I'd like to acknowledge people in my lab and my colleagues at the University of Iowa, my collaborators, our funding sources, and my home base at the University of Iowa. And thank you for your time and attention.